A quiet discrepancy surfaced and an economy's direction suddenly looked reversible. On paper, exports rose and records balanced. Yet the values seemed to finish somewhere else, leaving stability unchanged and pressure quietly building. What does this shift mean for you when Ibrahim Traoré invokes an unfinished revolution and signals that the endpoint of value may be moved back home? What followed next forced an entire system to pause. You are about to hear an explanation that most public discussions avoid, not because it is unclear, but because it shifts responsibility from personalities to systems. You will gain a clearer way to read the signals, understand the pressure points, and see why recent moves matter beyond headlines. This is not information meant for casual listening. If you stop here, the risk is not missing a detail but misreading the entire situation. Events may look like isolated decisions, reactions may seem exaggerated, and warnings may sound abstract when they are not. Without the full frame, it becomes easy to mistake structural resistance for normal bureaucracy or to confuse patience with stability. That misunderstanding carries a cost. It leaves observers relying on surface narratives while deeper mechanisms continue unchanged. Staying with this explanation allows you to follow how value moves where it's lows, and why certain choices trigger quiet but decisive pushback. It also clarifies why timing matters, while language shifts before outcomes do, and why what appears calm on the surface can conceal growing strain underneath. The first thing to understand is that this is not a rumor or a symbolic gesture, it is a measurable deviation that signals something deeper. A single export ledger showed one figure leaving the country, while international records reflected a higher volume received abroad, a gap large enough to raise questions, but quiet enough to be left pending rather than explained. Small on its own, pointed to a familiar pattern resurfacing under new scrutiny as Ibrahim Traoré began invoking the language unfinished change. One number matters here because it frames the scale of the issue. Export volumes have risen while domestic stability indicators have barely moved, creating a widening gap between growth on paper and outcomes on the ground. This contrast helps explain why the issue did not begin with speeches or elections, but with the roots that determine where value ultimately settles. The background unfolds from a simple starting point. Burkina Faso exports resources that are essential to global markets, yet those exports have historically failed to translate into internal resilience. Then return slowly, reduced by layers of pricing rules, fees, and obligations set elsewhere. The result is an economy that appears active but remains constrained, working hard without controlling its own final step. This is why the reference to earlier revolutionary language resonates now, when Ibrahim Traoré speaks of finishing what was interrupted. The implication is not nostalgia but logistics. The original interruption occurred when attempts were made to redirect value inward through local processing and tighter control over contracts. Those efforts interfered with established corridors that had been stable for decades, and stability elsewhere translated into pressure at home. The seriousness escalates because this pattern affects people before it reaches policy debates. Communities see exports increase while services lag. Workers notice production without payoff. The first groups affected are not abstract markets, but households and local enterprises that feel the imbalance long before it appears in official statements. At this point, the issue stops being about a single discrepancy and becomes about whether a long-standing direction can be altered without provoking resistance. That question sets the stage for everything that follows. At this stage, the story gains clarity because a guide emerges not as a hero, but as a lens through which the shift can be read. It comes from observers inside trade and finance who do not speak in slogans, but in documents, approvals, and delays. Their credibility rests on proximity rather than visibility, because they see how decisions move once headlines fade. One of them describes the early impact in practical terms. Contracts that once passed routinely began to pause. Reviews took longer. Requests for clarification multiplied. None of this looked dramatic, yet each delay subtly altered cash flow and planning assumptions. The system did not break, it tightened. That tightening was the first signal that something had changed beneath the surface. A second example confirms that this was not an isolated reaction. Exporters noticed that negotiations felt heavier, more cautious, even though demand remained steady. Risk language entered conversations where it had not been dominant before. The pattern repeated across files, regions, and agencies, suggesting coordination without coordination. A shared instinct rather than an explicit directive. These observations matter because they explain how pressure often appears before confrontation. There is no announcement and no single moment to point to. Friction accumulates in small, procedural ways that only insiders recognize early. By the time effects reach the public, they feel sudden, even though they have been forming quietly. This is where the role of leadership becomes relevant. When Ibrahim Traoré signals an intention to alter routes rather than rhetoric, those who understand the machinery recognize the implication immediately. It is not the words that matter most, but the expectation that processes may no longer run as before. From this point on, the question is no longer whether something is happening, but how far it can go before resistance hardens into a defining test. It began with a subtle shift that few noticed, and what had once moved automatically started to hesitate. Before this moment, exports flowed outward with predictable efficiency afterward. Each step felt newly conditional. That before and after contrast marked the trigger, the point where a familiar rhythm quietly broke as Ibrahim Traoré's message began to be read as intent rather than symbolism. Then the escalation arrived. Clarifications were requested in rapid succession. Risk assessments were recalculated. One decision prompted another, and each response generated a further check. The pace quickened, not in visibility but in density. What had been a straight line became a cluster of intersections, each one capable of slowing the entire route. Pressure spread outward in short bursts. Credit conversations grew cautious. Insurance terms tightened. Partners asked for reassurance that had never been required before. None of these moves carried a signature, yet together they formed a clear pattern. The system was reacting without declaring itself, applying weight through procedure rather than force. As the climax passed, the aftershock set in. The immediate scramble subsided. But the effects remained. Planning horizons shortened. Commitments were framed with contingencies. The sense of inevitability that once surrounded export corridors gave way to uncertainty. This was not chaos, but recalibration, a reminder that stability depends on alignment, not momentum. The residue of this phase is what makes it consequential. Once delays become normal, they reshape expectations. It alters behavior long after the initial trigger fades. For households and firms watching from the outside, the change feels abstract. It feels irreversible. By the end of this sequence, one thing was clear. The events were no longer isolated reactions, they had formed a living timeline that suggested a system testing how far a redirection might be allowed to go before it pushed back more firmly. Before moving further, the tone shifts deliberately, because this is where impressions give way to weight. But about scale, speed, and human reach, taken together rather than in isolation. When those three align, they describe a system under strain more clearly than any single headline. The first measure frames the size of the problem. Export volumes have trended upward, while core domestic indicators have remained largely flat. That divergence matters because it shows growth without closure, movement without arrival. When an economy expands on paper, but delivers limited internal payoff, the distance between effort and outcome becomes structural rather than accidental. The second measure captures speed. The shift from routine processing to layered review did not take decades, it unfolded within a short window measured in weeks rather than years. Processes that once cleared in days began stretching into longer cycles. And each added interval compounded uncertainty. This compression of change is what turns adjustment into pressure, because actors must respond before new equilibria can form. The third measure reflects human impact. When delays ripple through contracts and payments, the effect reaches households quickly. A missed payment window can mean postponed wages, deferred maintenance, or reduced local spending. Multiplied across sectors, even a modest slowdown touches thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on timing more than totals. This is where abstraction dissolves and consequence becomes tangible. Taken together, these measures explain why the discussion cannot remain theoretical. Scale shows the breadth, speed shows the intensity, and human reach shows the cost. None of these alone would be decisive, but aligned, they reveal why talk of redirection is treated seriously. When Ibrahim Traoré signals a willingness to challenge where value settles, the numbers suggest that the response will not be rhetorical. At this point, the evidence locks in a simple understanding. The issue is neither exaggerated nor distant. It is present, measurable, and already shaping behavior. Even before outcomes fully surface, there is a reason serious objections continue to surface, and they deserve to be stated clearly rather than dismissed. However imperfect, provide predictability. From this view, stability comes from keeping established corridors open. Because investors, insurers, and partners can plan around known rules, sudden attempts to redirect value, the argument goes, risk spooking capital, slowing growth, and hurting the very populations such changes are meant to help. That position is not weak. Predictability does matter, especially for economies with limited buffers. Yet it overlooks a key point revealed by recent patterns. Predictability has not translated into resilience. The same roots that promise calm have repeatedly produced growth without durability, leaving countries exposed when conditions shift. Stability that depends on permanent outflow is not stability at all, it is deferred vulnerability. The logic holds only if outcomes improve, and the evidence suggests they have not. A second objection focuses on capacity. Critics argue that redirecting value inward requires institutions strong enough to manage contracts, processing, and pricing locally. Without that capacity, they warn, redirection could simply replace one inefficiency with another, creating bottlenecks at home rather than abroad. Again, the concern is reasonable. Capacity does matter. But this view assumes capacity emerges independently of control. In practice, capacity is built through responsibility. When the final step remains external, incentives to invest in domestic capability weaken. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Limited capacity justifies external routing, and external routing prevents capacity from forming. But maintaining it guarantees stagnation. Placed side by side, these arguments clarify the real issue. The debate is not between caution and recklessness, but between managing risk now or absorbing it later. Once both perspectives are weighed, the shape of the problem becomes clearer, and so does the reason the discussion has intensified. Everything shifted at the midpoint. The change was not announced, yet it reframed the entire sequence. What had looked like a technical dispute over exports began to read as a test of whether routes themselves could be questioned without triggering automatic correction. The focus moved away from individual files and toward the invisible layer that manages delay, approval, and compliance. But it decides whether decisions travel forward or stall quietly. This is where the significance deepens. When Ibrahim Traoré repeats the language of finishing interrupted work, it intersects directly with this layer's role. The implication is not a new policy headline, but exposure. If contracts are reopened, if revenue paths are digitized, and if approvals become traceable, then delay loses its protective cover. What once looked like neutral procedure becomes visible choice. The effect of that visibility is decisive. Processes that relied on complexity to defend continuity are forced into daylight, where justification replaces habit. Even before reforms are finalized, the expectation alone alters behavior. Actors begin preparing for scrutiny rather than assuming silence. This moment changes the direction of the story. It signals that earlier sections described only the surface tension. Beneath it lies a deeper contest over who controls movement and who benefits from opacity. From here forward, consequences stop being hypothetical and start aligning with lived outcomes. The consequences become visible once the midpoint insight meets daily reality. What had been framed as technical adjustment begins to touch institutions, markets, and households in distinct ways. The shift is gradual, but its reach is broad, and it does not stay confined to policy rooms for long. At the level of the state, pressure concentrates around decision-making. Authorities faced tighter margins as timing grows uncertain and credibility is tested by both partners and citizens. Each delayed approval or revised assessment forces choices that balance continuity against assertion. Over time, this strains administrative confidence, because governance must now account not only for outcomes, but for the path taken to reach them. When Ibrahim Traoré frames redirection as necessary rather than symbolic, the state is pulled into a position where hesitation itself becomes a signal, read externally and internally. For businesses, the effect is immediate and practical. Firms that depend on predictable export cycles encounter new friction in financing and logistics. Cash flow assumptions shift as reviews lengthen and conditions multiply. Some companies absorb the cost, others postpone investment or scale back plans. The result is not collapse but caution. And that adjustment redistributes risk unevenly, favoring those with buffers while exposing smaller operators to volatility they did not create. Among citizens, the impact feels quieter but sharper. Delays upstream translate into postponed wages, reduced hours, or higher prices downstream. Households experience the change not as ideology, but as timing. Bills arrive on schedule, income does not. This mismatch erodes trust in promises of growth because lived experience contradicts aggregate figures. The sense that effort does not convert into security reinforces the perception that the problem lies in structure rather than individual failure. Beyond national borders, the regional and international dimension comes into focus. Neighboring states watch closely, aware that precedent travels faster than policy. If roots can be questioned in one place, they may be questioned elsewhere. Signaling concern while monitoring exposure, the effect resembles a ripple rather than a shock, but ripples accumulate. Even small deviations can prompt broader reassessment, especially when they align with existing tensions across the region. Taken together, these layers show why the situation resists simple interpretation. No single group controls the outcome, yet each is affected by it. The state manages pressure, businesses manage uncertainty. Citizens manage consequence, and the region manages expectation. When Ibrahim Traoré places emphasis on altering where value settles, the response is not uniform resistance or support, but a reordering of behavior across all four groups. The result is a shared condition. No actor stands fully outside the process, and no outcome remains isolated. What began as a technical question now operates as a social and economic fact, shaping choices long before it resolves. The most likely path forward is neither dramatic collapse nor sudden transformation, but a prolonged phase of adjustment. In this base scenario, procedures continue to slow and recalibrate while no decisive break is announced. And the system absorbs pressure without yielding fully in either direction. Stability is maintained, but at the cost of momentum. And the tension becomes normalized as actors learn to operate within narrower margins. A more optimistic scenario depends on coordination and credibility arriving before fatigue sets in. And measurable follow-through gradually reduce uncertainty. Over time, some routes are renegotiated rather than resisted, and confidence rebuilds around revised rules. The transition is uneven, but not paralyzing. Small gains accumulate, delays shorten, and domestic capability begins to grow where responsibility is clearly assigned. This path is difficult, but it offers a way to convert disruption into durable improvement without provoking sustained backlash. The worst-case scenario emerges if pressure hardens while clarity remains absent. In that case, delays deepen into distrust and caution turns into withdrawal. Investment pauses lengthen, and households absorb compounding shocks as income timing slips repeatedly. The system does not fail outright, but it bends back toward familiar patterns, reopening old routes under new justifications. The cost is not just economic, it is psychological, reinforcing the belief that attempts at change inevitably exhaust themselves. Across all three scenarios, one principle holds: outcomes are shaped less by intent than by execution and endurance. Signals matter, but consistency matters more. Timing matters, but alignment matters most. The future does not hinge on predicting which scenario will occur, but on recognizing that each remains plausible under current conditions. The strategic lesson is therefore restraint paired with vigilance. Observers should watch for concrete markers rather than rhetoric, for shortened cycles rather than promises, and for transparency that persists beyond initial announcements. Preparation means understanding that progress may appear incremental, setbacks may masquerade as pragmatism, and patience may be tested repeatedly. In this context, The question is not which future is guaranteed, but which behaviors increase the chance of a better one. And shared accountability become the quiet determinants of direction. Everything else follows from those choices. After tracing the structure, the pressure, and the possible paths ahead, the focus naturally turns to the person listening. The larger forces may seem distant, but their effects are filtered through everyday decisions and expectations. The question that matters now is how this situation intersects with different kinds of viewers, each standing at a different distance from the center of events. For those who follow these developments closely, attention already provides an advantage. Understanding how routes, delays, and signals interact allows patterns to be recognized earlier than headlines reveal them. Yet this position also carries a responsibility. Rapid shifts mean that yesterday's assumptions can expire quietly. Staying engaged requires tracking processes rather than personalities and adjusting expectations as conditions evolve, not after outcomes are obvious. A second group feels the impact indirectly. Their work, savings, or local environment is shaped by forces they do not control, but cannot ignore. For them, the value of understanding lies in preparedness. Awareness reduces surprise. It helps frame changes in income, prices, or opportunity not as personal failure, but as part of a broader adjustment. That framing alone can influence choices about spending, planning, and resilience. There is also a group that may feel untouched and prefer distance. Indifference can seem reasonable when consequences are uneven and delayed. Yet systems rarely announce when they cross thresholds. Those who arrive late to understanding often arrive when options have narrowed. Even a basic grasp of the underlying direction helps avoid being caught entirely off guard when indirect effects become direct. Across these groups, one point connects them: knowledge restores a sense of agency. It does not eliminate risk, but it changes how risk is perceived and managed. When people understand why timing slips or why caution spreads, uncertainty becomes something to navigate rather than endure blindly. Regardless of where each viewer stands, following this story is less about choosing sides and more about choosing awareness. Staying informed, watching signals rather than slogans, and recognizing early shifts allows individuals to remain participants rather than bystanders as the situation continues to unfold. It becomes clear that solutions cannot remain abstract, because ambiguity favors delay. Any response that relies on slogans or declarations alone will dissolve once pressure returns. What matters instead is a sequence of actions that anchors intent into systems and makes reversal costly. The first step is at the center of authority. Leadership must translate direction into procedures with defined timelines and visible benchmarks. That means reopening priority contracts under clear criteria, digitizing revenue tracking, and publishing process milestones that can be checked externally. Progress is not measured by announcements, but by shortened approval cycles and traceable decision paths. Its credibility depends on whether these markers appear and persist beyond the initial phase. The second step involves organizations and firms operating within the system. Their role is execution rather than declaration. Aligning internal controls with new requirements, and adapting to transparent reporting reduces friction over time. Success here is measured by stability under scrutiny, fewer stalled files, clearer compliance expectations, and predictable turnaround despite tighter oversight. The third step belongs to citizens and communities. This level does not require grand action, but consistent engagement. Tracking public data, paying attention to budget releases, and questioning unexplained delays shifts norms gradually. Measurement at this level is behavioral rather than numeric, reflected in sustained attention rather than episodic outrage. A fourth step, where feasible, extends outward. Regional coordination and shared standards reduce isolation and distribute risk. When neighboring systems move in parallel, pressure diffuses rather than concentrates. Indicators here include aligned and comparable transparency measures across borders. Taken together, these steps share a single principle: execution decides outcomes. Systems change only when actions are specific, observable, and continuous. Even well-framed intentions lose force and drift back into familiarity. The image that returns now is not a speech or a document, but the earlier moment when routine processes first began to slow. That subtle hesitation marked the start of a longer journey. One that has moved from quiet discrepancies to open questions about direction and control. What seemed minor then has since unfolded into a chain of recognition, resistance, and possibility. Looking back across that path, the progression becomes clear. Arguments were weighed, a deeper layer came into view, consequences spread outward, touching institutions, markets, and households. Through each stage, the story stopped being about isolated events and became about how systems behave when their assumptions are challenged. Ibrahim Traoré appears in this arc not as a singular solution, but as a catalyst who forces attention onto what had long been treated as immovable. The emotional weight lies here. This is not simply an analysis of trade routes or administrative delay. It is about effort and reward drifting apart, about communities sensing that movement does not always lead to arrival, and about the quiet frustration that builds when work fails to translate into security. However contested, that awareness can turn into ownership rather than resignation. At this point, the meaning sharpens. The question is no longer whether change is uncomfortable, but whether continuity without closure is acceptable. Systems endure when they remain unseen. This is where the story settles, not in certainty, but in choice. From here, direction is shaped less by promises than by vigilance. The closing note follows naturally from that reflection, because conversations like this do not end with conclusions, but with shared attention. Everyone arrives with a different lens shaped by experience, distance, and expectation. That diversity of perspective is not a weakness, it is what allows a fuller picture to emerge. If this explanation felt worth your time, it may also be worth someone else's understanding. But about widening the circle of awareness so fewer people rely only on surface narratives. The more eyes that follow processes rather than personalities, the harder it becomes for important shifts to pass unnoticed. This is also an open space for dialogue. Interpretations will differ, and that is part of the value. Some may see caution where others see opportunity. Others on responsibility. The question that matters is how these views interact, not which one dominates. What do you think is the most important signal to watch as this situation continues to develop? Do you want to continue to the next part?